Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. The Russian writer Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, 1918 to 2008, is the author of modern classics such as The Gulag Archipelago, The First Circle, and Cancer Ward. Born and raised in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, he served as an artillery officer in the Red Army during World War II. In 1945, he was arrested by Russian counterintelligence while in active duty in East Prussia. He had committed the crime of criticizing Stalin in private letters to a childhood friend. He served 8 years in various prisons, 2 in exile, and almost died from an undiagnosed cancer. During those 10 years, he came to understand communism's inherently dehumanizing nature, found much of the materials around which he would build his future novels, and regained his faith as a Russian Orthodox Christian. In 1962, he was allowed to publish his first novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. However, after Khrushchev's deposition in 1964, the Soviet authorities put a stop to the publication of his other writings, and in 1974 expelled him. Once in the West, he would finally receive the Nobel Prize for Literature he had been awarded 4 years earlier. Initially lionised in the West, he soon fell out of favour in some quarters. It became apparent that his opposition to communism and the Soviet regime did not make him, as many had wrongly supposed, a secular liberal and progressive. While he appreciated the valid aspects of Western political culture, such as the rule of law and local self-government, he criticized the rise of secular humanism. In 1994, he returned to Russia, where he died in 2008. In this interview, Daniel J. Mahoney will explain the significance of Solzhenitsyn by taking us through his pick of 5 of the author's works. Daniel J. Mahoney is a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, professor emeritus of Assumption University. His recent books include The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage and Moderation, published by Encounter Books, Recovering Politics, Civilization in the Soul, Essays on Pierre Manon and Roger Scruton, published by St. Augustine's Press, and The Idol of Our Age, How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity. On the subject of this interview, he has written Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology, and The Other Solzhenitsyn, Telling the Truth About a Misunderstood Writer and Thinker, published in 2020. With Edward E. Erickson Jr., he is the author of The Solzhenitsyn Reader, New and Essential Writings, 1947 to 2005. Professor Mahoney, welcome.
Thank you very much, Father Farrell.
What should be added to the preceding biographical sketch of Solzhenitsyn?
Well, I think your sketch was quite good. I would say just a few things. One, Solzhenitsyn, as you noted, was born in 1918, which means he lived his entire life under the shadow of Bolshevism and the Bolshevik Revolution. But he was raised by his mother, who was a widow. His father had died in a hunting accident while his mother was pregnant with him. And his Aunt Irina. He was raised in a Christian family, an Orthodox family, and he remained, I think, within that milieu right up until his teenage years, when the pressure of Soviet education became overwhelming. I remember somewhere Solzhenitsyn writing about his humiliation and looking back, or his shame and looking back, and remembering having torn a crucifix from his neck when he was in high school. But there was something in Solzhenitsyn, in the chapter called The Blue Caps in the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago. He talks about how recruiters from the NKVD came to his high school. And he said, at the time he was a convinced Marxist, an enthusiast for the revolution, but he said something held him back. Something filled him with revulsion. And he says, these were the products of the copper coins left to us from our forebears at a time when good and evil was not relative. So Solzhenitsyn's break with communism, the scales of ideology falling from his eyes in prison and camp, didn't come out of nowhere. There was something in his soul and something in his background that prepared him, I think, to engage in this spiritual break and spiritual ascent from communism. And let me just add a little bit about the latter point of the biography that you had sketched. I think it's often misstated that Solzhenitsyn thought Western democracy and Soviet communism were equally bad and that kind of nothing of the sort. As you pointed out, Solzhenitsyn, he criticized a soulless legalism as dehumanizing. He always believed that the rule of law was an indispensable pillar and foundation of a free and decent society. Secondly, he wrote very eloquently in many different writings in the last 20 or 30 years of his life about the importance of building democracy from the bottom up. He was impressed by the forms of local self-government he saw at work in Switzerland and New England. And he thought, you can't just, after 70 years of communism, you can't just introduce plebiscitary democracy, parliamentary elections. You have to form habits of citizenship and self-government. And he did his best to encourage Russians to move in that direction. Without, I think, great success. But nonetheless, his words on that subject remain very, very important. I would add two other things. One, central to Solzhenitsyn's message in his prose writings, but it's also, I think, apparent in his fiction too, is an appeal to what he called repentance and self-limitation. When people criticize Solzhenitsyn as being anti-Western or anti-democratic, they forget that Solzhenitsyn was appealing to voluntary self-limitation, a freedom that acknowledged limits, a freedom that rejected anthropocentric humanism, as he called it, the denial of a higher sphere above the human will. So Solzhenitsyn was not an advocate of theocracy or coercion, but rather he thought there could be no freedom and human dignity without voluntary self-limitation. And repentance, of course, is a great theme, Christian theme. For Solzhenitsyn, it had political import too, because certainly after the 70-year period of Bolshevism, there needed to be deep soul searching, and Solzhenitsyn thought it was a mistake for people to see themselves merely as victims and not to see themselves as important respects participating in the ideological lie, as he called it. And I think Solzhenitsyn also, as a human being and Christian, thought repentance was he rejected the Marxist notion, as he put it in From Under the Rebel, that freedom meant succumbing to the yoke of necessity. He rejected the Enlightenment view, or at least one Enlightenment view, that freedom was simply, following one's self-interest. And he wanted to reconnect freedom to these deeper spiritual roots, which included a recognition of liberty under God, or liberty under God and the law, but also a penitential soul, souls who use their freedom in a spirit of responsibility. And I would just, on that note, I would add the theme of conscience. Solzhenitsyn always said, he says one character, an important character in the first circle says, I used to think we only had one life, the kind of Epicurean view. And he said, but I came to realize we only have one conscience, so the conscience authentically understood, not as a synonym for subjectivism or doing what you feel is right, but fidelity to conscience in the deep and abiding sense, Solzhenitsyn thought was the hallmark of a human being.
Did you ever meet Solzhenitsyn?
No. I had some correspondence with Solzhenitsyn, and Solzhenitsyn kindly wrote a endorsement for the Solzhenitsyn Reader, of which I was co-editor. But I must say, I did meet on several occasions Natalia Solzhenitsyn, Solzhenitsyn's second wife, who was very much his intellectual, literary, and spiritual partner and editor. And she's a wonderful woman and continues his work, especially the 30 volumes of the collected works in Russian. And of course, Mrs. Solzhenitsyn and two of Solzhenitsyn's three sons, Ignat, the musician, and Stepan, who now lives in Russia. They're very close friends, and we've collaborated on many projects. And Mrs. Solzhenitsyn did ask me to write the introductions to the 2 volumes of Solzhenitsyn's memoirs about his years in the West. And the Solzhenitsyns as a whole gave us immense enthusiastic support as we worked on collecting and collating the pieces in the Solzhenitsyn Reader. So I have I think a close relation. I've been to Cavendish several times where the Solzhenitsyns lived, and which is really wonderful to see because you have a much better sense. These were the years 1976 to 1994, where Solzhenitsyn lived and wrote in the West, in Vermont, and rather than being this, sort of armed camp you would read about in the press, it was a lovely home in a very natural setting in a small town of Vermont where Solzhenitsyn and his family got along very well with their neighbors. So, there's a lot of nonsense written in the press, but that tends to happen to people who challenge the dominant spirit of the age.
What drew you to study Solzhenitsyn?
Well, I have to say, I'm 63. I was born in 1960. And when I was I was rather intellectually precocious. I read a lot of serious fiction and nonfiction as a teenager. And I think I did my 8th grade report. We had to pick at my Catholic school, we had to pick a major writer and do a report on them. And I did my report on Solzhenitsyn. So I read, to the best of my ability, of course, works like the Gulag Archipelago when they came out, From Under the Rubble, the manifesto for a Christian manifesto for post-communist Russia, one of the books Solzhenitsyn edited and published in 1974 in the Russian. So I always had an interest in Russia, but I'm a political scientist. I'm not a Russianist in the narrow sense, but I was appalled by the nonsense that was written about Solzhenitsyn. I was appalled by the lack of care in approaching his work, the cliches, just the same old half-truths and distortions recycled. And so I decided to write a book on Solzhenitsyn that became 2001's The Ascent from Ideology. And I must say the reception of the book from people who genuinely knew and appreciated Solzhenitsyn's work was extremely positive, including the Solzhenitsyn family, and that made possible all the work of collaboration later on. But it was just, Solzhenitsyn did an interview with David Aikman, a very talented journalist who you may years ago Time magazine was a serious magazine, and David Aikman covered things from Russia and China. He did an interview in 1989 with Solzhenitsyn, and Solzhenitsyn said about these things that were said about him, they never give any quotes. And it struck me as I embarked on, I've done a lot, as the titles of my book suggest, I haven't dedicated myself exclusively to writing about Solzhenitsyn, but engaging Solzhenitsyn's work has been a major part of my own intellectual itinerary. And it began, I think, simply from the fact that there was a need. And but my books, The Ascent from Ideology, has been published in French by Fayard, which is the major French publisher that publishes all of Solzhenitsyn in French. And both of my Solzhenitsyn books have been translated into Romanian and some other languages. So the reception has been, very good in the sense that there was a crying need, I think, for a genuinely thoughtful and sympathetic engagement, an effort to understand Solzhenitsyn as he understood himself, which is, the postmoderns and others don't believe in that principle. So there was this woman named Elizabeth Kriese. She's a Danish scholar, hates Solzhenitsyn. He's homophobic, he's transphobic. I don't know, Solzhenitsyn would know what trans meant, but her complaint was, she said, we need to bring Solzhenitsyn in from critical exile. And what she meant by that was bring queer theory, gender theory, postmodernism, and all of that to bear. In other words, to mutilate Solzhenitsyn in the name of ideological critique. So thankfully, while there are many silly things written about Solzhenitsyn, he has not yet been subject to that kind of, monstrously tendacious scholarship. Why anyone would waste their time trying to, understand Solzhenitsyn in light of those concerns, I don't know. So anyway, I think my work has filled a very important void, and and I certainly have deepened in my understanding and appreciation of Solzhenitsyn over the years.
You've mentioned some of the criticisms of Solzhenitsyn. Some question Solzhenitsyn's reliability as a historian. What is your assessment of his non-fiction writings in history?
I think The Red Wheel, his magisterial multi-volume work on the a work of literature and dramatized history that begins with August 1914 but has flashbacks to the Stolypin era. It's an effort to explain in a very non-Marxist way how Bolshevism came to Russia. And it wasn't historically necessitated, but many mistakes were made, many opportunities were lost. Russia's greatest statesman, Pyotr Stolypin, who was a tough-minded reformer and constitutionalist, who was hated both by the revolutionary left, but also by the reactionary time servers in the Tsar's court. He was assassinated in 1911, and that destroyed, I think, the possibility of a genuine statesman leading Tsarist Russia forward, perhaps avoiding World War I, and certainly conserving while reforming, in the words of Edmund Burke. I think Solzhenitsyn did impeccable research about the February Revolution. A lot of people who don't like The Red Wheel haven't read it. It's marvelously written. In March 1917, the street scenes where he captures the behavior and thinking of a revolutionary mob, and where he shows the giddiness of middle class and upper middle class St. Petersburgers for revolution, not thinking about the consequences. I think historically it's very faithful, very, very carefully researched. And I was about to say, I think some people who don't like the book don't like the message. And the message is that it was the February Revolution, the so-called Democratic Revolution, that destroyed authority, weakened the armed forces in time of war, and made the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks had 40,000 members in their party in the beginning of 1917. They were a tiny movement, but they were able to take advantage of the increasing failure of the war, of course, the Russian end of World War I, but mainly just the power vacuum, the lack of legitimate authority of the provisional government. Solzhenitsyn says somewhere that the provisional government governed for a total of -2 days. In other words, democracy needs authority, and anarchy just paves the way for either civil war or tyranny. And in the case of the February Revolution, it ultimately paved the way for both. The Gulag Archipelago, it's not a work of history, but I think it's a historically accurate work. It's based on Solzhenitsyn's own experience in the camps. It's based on official Soviet documentation that he had access to. It's based on the testimony of 257 people. If you look at the most recent abridgment, the authorized abridgment done by Ed Erickson with Solzhenitsyn in 1984, there's also an abridgment available for Russians done by Natalia Solzhenitsyn. But in any case, if you look at the appendix to that, you have a list of all the people Solzhenitsyn spoke to, or whose memoirs they read, who wrote letters to him. And I think Anne Applebaum, in her 2007 introduction to the abridgment, still available from Harper and Row, says the essentials are all right. The whole Gulag experience, the larger analysis and critique of ideology. Of course, there's the issue of how many people were imprisoned and killed by the Bolshevik regime, and that's a very contested question. Solzhenitsyn gives high numbers, but he's including not so many people who died in the Gulag or in prison. He's including victims of famine, people who were shot, people who died in the Civil War. And of course, we always hear 27 million Soviets died during World War II. Yes, but so many died in large part because Stalin saw no value in human life. He just threw Ivan after Ivan after Ivan on the front, And that I think would be the only contested question. And Solzhenitsyn never claimed to be authoritative on that. Did the Soviet regime in the Lenin and Stalin period, was it responsible for the death of 20 million people, 35 million people, 45 million people? That's a disputed question. But Anthony Beaver and others have recently argued that up to 18 million people perished during the revolution. And many people died of famine as a result of war communism and accompanying disease. None of this would have happened without the Bolshevik Revolution. But no, Solzhenitsyn is not a professional historian, but I can assure you that he approached the historical dimensions of his work with great concern for verisimilitude. He spent much time in the archives of the Hoover Institution, for example, had access to material that very few people would have had access to. So, no, I think that claim is made, and it's made on the internet by fools, but I think it happens not to be true.
Are there any special reasons why Catholics should read Solzhenitsyn?
Well, because Solzhenitsyn is one of the great men of the 20th century. He embodied that quality of soul that the classics called megalosoukia, greatness of soul, but always with a Christian emphasis on repentance, self-limitation, and deference to the Creator God. I think, today the sectarian differences mean far less. The real divisions in the churches are between those who remain faithful to the apostolic inheritance and the moral law and a substantial and non-relativistic understanding of conscience and the drama of good and evil in the human soul, and those who believe in that everything is historically and culturally determined, that the faith changes, that the Holy Spirit is coextensive with the zeitgeist, sexual or otherwise. I think some people too also, we can overdo the Russian Orthodox attribution to Solzhenitsyn. Yes, he returned to the faith of his fathers, and he was a serious Russian Orthodox. He was not at all sectarian. He wasn't like Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky hated the Poles and thought Dostoevsky was a great thinker, and I can't think of anything more important than reading in the present moment The Possessed or The Demons. But Dostoevsky had a lot of pet peeves, and you read The Grand Inquisitor in Brothers Karamazov, and you see he had many prejudices about the Catholic Church. Solzhenitsyn didn't have any of them. He said when he in an interview with Janusz Sapiec in February '79, when asked about the relatively new Polish Pope, he said, "Words fail me. It's a gift from God." And he met John Paul II on the 15th anniversary of John Paul II's pontificate on October 15th, 1993. He had a 3-hour private meeting with the Pope. I think that's quite significant, that Solzhenitsyn was traveling through Western Europe, sort of saying his goodbyes before he would return to post-communist Russia in May of 1994, but the fact that his travels in Western Europe included a meeting with John Paul II was quite significant. And in his memoirs, Between Two Millstones, he speaks about his admiration for John Paul II. So I think Solzhenitsyn not only diagnoses the tragedies and worse that flow from rejecting the sovereignty of God and the moral law, but he also recovers in a work like the Gulag Archipelago, the great drama of good and evil in the human soul. And so I think as an anthropologist of the soul, as a critic of the terrible mendacity that informs the Manichaeanism and mendacity that informs totalitarian ideology, and his recovery of the soul and its possibilities of ascent, the need to turn away from a merely hedonic and materialist calculus. I think Solzhenitsyn is unsurpassed. So I think Catholics have every reason to read and admire and learn from Solzhenitsyn.
Your first recommended book is the comprehensive anthology that you edited with Edward E. Erickson Jr., The Solzhenitsyn Reader, New and Essential Writings, 1947 to 2005. Are there any chapters that you would recommend in particular from this book?
Yes. Among other things, by the way, this book, it's a commented anthology, so we have a quite substantial portrait of Solzhenitsyn's life and thought. We also have introductions to each of the selections. Some, as in the case of the Gulag Archipelago and the Red Wheel, are quite substantive. Others, for shorter pieces, are one page or so. So I think all of that is very helpful to the reader. Yeah, this is the most comprehensive collection in any language of Solzhenitsyn's writings. Stepan Solzhenitsyn told me that he calculated that 80% of Solzhenitsyn's writings are here in one. For example, early on, we have an excerpt from The Trail, Dorshenka, the road or the way or the trail. It's a autobiographical poem that Solzhenitsyn wrote in the camp with no pen and paper, only using a rosary some Lithuanian friends had given him as a mnemonic device, and it's 7,000 words. And it's an account of his own intellectual and spiritual odyssey, from Marxism to through the war, through all of it. It's really indispensable. And the only other part of it that had appeared in English was we published a section called Besed. A very dramatic section was the section called Prussian Nights. There are 3 poems from prison camp and exile, including a better translation of Akathistas, the Song of Praise. That appears in the Ascent, in the central section of the Gulag, The Soul and Barbed Wire, and it's the great Song of Praise where Solzhenitsyn explains quite dramatically and movingly his loss of faith and his recovery of faith. God of the universe, I believe again. You were always with me. It's very beautiful, very substantive, very important statement, and I think a great work of literature. The short stories include Matryona's Home, which is probably Solzhenitsyn's best story of a Russian peasant woman who was very dedicated to others, but very un-Soviet. She was a product of the old Russia, a little bit superstitious, but very, very Christian. The one person without whom the land or the village cannot survive, as Solzhenitsyn says, paraphrasing the book of Genesis at the end of the piece. There's an excerpt from The Oak and the Calf, Solzhenitsyn's memoir about beginning as an underground writer. There are substantial excerpts from The First Circle and Cancer Ward and the Gulag Archipelago, as well as important, I would say representative and important chapters from The Red Wheel, from August 1914, November 1916, March 1917, April 1917. I would say those who really want to discover Solzhenitsyn's other great works should read The Red Wheel, all the volumes as they come out from University of Notre Dame Press. But those who want to read a representative sample of the best and best written and most revealing chapters should, and many on Christian themes, a dialogue between Sonia Solzhenitsyn and Father Severin, who about pacifism and Tolstoy and can you fight for your country if you're Christian? That's all here. And again, for the busy reader who wants to get a taste of The Red Wheel, that's the place to go. I would say that maybe the two most important sections, the essays and speeches, the Nobel lecture, very beautiful text. Solzhenitsyn says there's two kinds of writers: the writer who thinks of himself as self-expressive, inventing, creating as an autonomous being, and the humble apprentice under God's heaven who tries to realistically convey the nature of reality and the drama of the soul. That's their repentance and self-limitation in the life of nations. The great text, Live Not by Lies, which is quite relevant for our situation today. The Harvard Address, the 1983 Templeton Address for Progress in Religion, where Solzhenitsyn probably lays out his convictions in the most satisfactory way. The final section is called Miniatures, 1958 to 63, 1996 to 1999. These are very beautiful, meditative reflections, Kokotki in Russian, tinies, miniatures. Sometimes in English they're called prose poems. They're reflections on nature, on death, on the human soul. He wrote some in Russia in the 60s and 50s and others when he returned home. They also include two of his prayers, the prayer he wrote on really becoming a very famous writer with the worldwide publication of One Day, and then a prayer for Russia from 1997, when Russia came out from under the rubble of communism in a very bad way, and Solzhenitsyn was deeply worried that the country and culture were in the process of collapse. So he wrote a prayer that he said every night called A Prayer for Russia, and it's a very, very beautiful prayer. And the prayers, I think, illustrate a personal dimension of Solzhenitsyn's faith. That's certainly his faith isn't implicit in everything he did, but those prayers are both moving. They're works of literature too, but they're, for admirers of Solzhenitsyn, they're a glimpse into his own soul and his own reaching out to the goodness and grace of God. So that's the Solzhenitsyn reader.
The second book is probably Solzhenitsyn's best-known one, the Gulag Archipelago. There are various editions of this work. Which one do you recommend?
Well, for those who want the whole experience, the 3 volumes are available in print from Harper Collins, volumes 1, 2, and 3, but they come to 1,500, 1,600 pages. So ideally, one should read that. But I think the abridgment, the authorized abridgment that Ed Erickson did in cooperation with Solzhenitsyn, that was first published in 1985, it's very deftly done. It includes all the essential sections and at least parts of the abridged sections. It gives the reader a very satisfactory sense of the whole. It allows the busy and preoccupied reader not just to read 100 pages of volume 1 and never get to some really important stuff, but to get a sense of the whole, engage the whole in a meaningful and satisfactory way. I would say if a reader has limited time, read the chapter in the abridgment. I recommend, you'd have to get it from Amazon.uk. I think you can probably get it from Amazon in America, but at a little bit of a delay. The 2018 version of the abridgment, which has all sorts of ancillary material, including information on the people Solzhenitsyn consulted with, the 257. But there's a magisterial introduction by Jordan P. Peterson on the significance, the permanent significance of the book. But I would say for the busy, preoccupied reader, read the chapter on the blue caps. The blue caps was a colloquial name for the organs, for the secret police. Why did men succumb to that kind of evil? Why did Solzhenitsyn resist becoming a blue cap even when he was a young, dedicated Marxist ideologue? What is the specific source of ideology? Solzhenitsyn says Shakespeare's evildoers stopped at a half a dozen cadavers because they had no ideology. How does ideology provide a justification for unprecedented tyranny and terror? And I would suggest reading the section called The Soul and Barbed Wire. The chapter, The Ascent, is a beautiful account. As Solzhenitsyn puts it, one has to make a decision. One had to make a decision in the camps. It's perfectly necessary and salutary to do your best to survive. But he says every prisoner had to decide whether they would survive at any price. And as Solzhenitsyn puts it, at any price meant at the price of others. But Solzhenitsyn argues so beautifully that once one rejects survival at any price, once one chooses the path of fidelity to truth and conscience, the possibilities of spiritual ascent arise. And Solzhenitsyn tells that, explains that in an almost phenomenological way, and more interesting, I think, than maybe the prose pieces where he articulates his religious convictions is this account of how spiritual ascent, rooted in a rejection of survival of any price, eventually leads Solzhenitsyn to a reaffirmation of his Christian faith. And, he says at the end of that beautiful chapter that it was only lying there on rotting prison straw that he saw the truth that the line between good and evil lies not between parties and ideologies, nations or classes, but right through each and every heart. And he goes on to argue that the problem with ideological revolution is that it thinks we can eliminate evildoers and therefore eliminate evil from the world. But Solzhenitsyn says this line between good and evil is in every human heart. And he says, the great religions of the world teach us that we can constrict evil, but we cannot expel it from the world. And Solzhenitsyn saw in any ideological movement, any Manichaean movement that saw, that located evil in a specific group, guilty for who they are and not what they've done, the Jews, the kulaks, the Christians, the merchants, or today, God knows, what the woke think, that he saw this as the road to perdition, And for learning all of that, he says at the end of that chapter, bless you, prison, for having been in my life. But he also goes on to write a chapter called on the soul of man under communism, where he says this system was so cruel, it placed such spiritual weights on vulnerable human beings. It made lie and betrayal a form of existence. I think he ultimately concluded this kind of system has to be resisted. And he gives a beautiful account in the third volume, the latter part of the abridgment, of the revolt at Kengir, where the prisoners took over a camp. They knew they were going to lose, but he thought in the act of rebellion, they were affirming their human dignity. They refused to be cowards. This too was an ascent of the soul through the important cardinal virtue of courage. So Solzhenitsyn certainly saw that spiritual ascent and redemptive suffering were possible in the camps, not for everyone, It's the path of the minority, but it's a real path. But he also saw that a system that cruelly tempts people to lie and betray on a daily basis, tearing families apart, betraying coworkers, repeating slogans that one knows to be utter falsehoods, denying the faith, that such a system needs to be resisted. Now, how it is to be resisted is another question, but Solzhenitsyn was not, like Tolstoy, a pacifist, although he also had great qualms about the, certainly rejected any indiscriminate use of violence. But it's very interesting because as a Christian and as a person who loved human freedom and hated totalitarian despotism, he had to wrestle with this question. What do you do? Or, he's not Alyosha the Baptist from One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, who's just happy to have the 24-year sentence so he can think about God. That's part of Solzhenitsyn, but that's not enough, because, human beings ultimately have to fight for a human order that respects human dignity. So that tension in Solzhenitsyn between welcoming redemptive suffering and resisting totalitarian evil is a very real tension. And it's a tension I think every thoughtful Christian can relate to.
You mentioned how the latest edition of the Gulag Archipelago underlines the enduring significance of the work. Would another way of putting this be to say that it identifies not just the characteristics of a hard totalitarianism, such as that of the Soviet Union, but also the characteristics of a soft totalitarianism?
I think that's right. And he made that, much of his critique of the West. By the way, he made very clear at the beginning of his Harvard address, he quotes he says, Veritas, truth is the motto of Harvard University, or was. And he says, I come here as a friend speaking truth. And part of that truth was that there are temptations that come from the very softness of the West. The temptation to, sounds a little bit like Heidegger, and that's only in this one regard, but Solzhenitsyn speaks about excessive engrossment in everyday life. Heidegger in Being and Time talks about average everydayness, where people get so caught up in material everydayness that they lose sight of being. Well, Solzhenitsyn doesn't talk like that, but they lose sight of the soul. They lose sight of the purpose of human existence and the meaning of true happiness. And, Solzhenitsyn was concerned that rule of law had degenerated into legalism. And he was concerned that Western democracies had lost sight of the transcendent grounds of human freedom and dignity. He always said, and he says this in the peroration of the Harvard address of 1978, he doesn't want, an inordinate emphasis on the soul at the expense of the body. He says, but under modernity, we have gone from perhaps, he says, in the Christian centuries, there was a tendency, perhaps, of not giving enough due to the needs and concerns of the body. But he says, now we live with a despotism of the material against we're excessively concerned with the body and material needs, and we've almost forgotten the human soul. So, Solzhenitsyn in the end endorses moderation, a balance of body and soul, but certainly a plea to Western peoples not to get so engrossed in everyday life that we lose sense of the real meaning and purpose of it. His final speech at the International Academy of Philosophy, which was a Catholic philosophical academy in Liechtenstein, it was his last great speech in the West, and he spoke there. He gave the title to that speech, "We have ceased to see the purpose." Purpose with a capital P, that, an understanding of freedom that lacks purposiveness, that lacks a sense that freedom is at the service of ends and purposes that elevate the human soul, but to be neutral about good and evil, or to affirm the radical autonomy of societies and individuals, I think Solzhenitsyn thought was a new form of the ideological lie.
The Gulag Archipelago is just one of the many 20th century classics that portray totalitarianism and its effects on the soul. There was also George Orwell's 1984, Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, and, on a different kind of totalitarianism, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. What sets the Gulag Archipelago apart from these other literary critiques of totalitarianism? Is it Solzhenitsyn's Christianity?
That's part of it, and I would say there's nothing quite like the section, The Soul and Barbed Wire. It's meditative reflection on the soul confronting soul-destroying tyranny. But I would say it's the Gulag Archipelago, its range is much broader than the aforementioned works I know well and admire, and they each have their moment in any reflection on the dehumanization of human beings in the late modern world. But Solzhenitsyn's perspective is so much broader. First of all, it's partly autobiographical, his own arrest, his own experience, his own recovery of not only faith, but of belief in natural right and justice and the primacy of conscience. But it's a comprehensive account of every aspect of the totalitarian experience. And that's, the horrible construction projects like the White Sea-Bellemare Canal, where tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands perished in the early 30s. An account on the war on the peasants, the aforementioned discussion of the human motives of the blue caps. There's a beautiful chapter, for example, on poets in the camps. You would think the last place in the world where people would give thanks, where people would reflect on the givenness of the universe and the gratuity of God would be in the camps. But quite the contrary. Solzhenitsyn, he memorializes and immortalizes these camp poets, an Orthodox poet named Stalin and others who would not be remembered except for Solzhenitsyn. And, Solzhenitsyn has a beautiful line. He says that in the camps, people were depersonalized, dehumanized. They had the buzz cuts. They had numbers, they Zec 254, Zec 1099. They were dirty. There was an effort to destroy any human distinctiveness, any distinctive personality. But he says these poets, and maybe this is, he has himself in mind with the Gulag Archipelago. He says they're able to restore the humanity to these depersonalized prisons. You see souls, you see faces, you see human persons. And that's what the Gulag Archipelago is. It's interesting, the subtitle is an experiment in literary or artistic investigation. It's the use of art and literature of a very high caliber that's able to do things that, there's great works of history, Robert Conquest's The Great Terror and others, Anne Applebaum's Gulag of History, but they pale into significance compared to the Gulag because they simply are not able to delve into the soul with anything like the literary power. And you mentioned Solzhenitsyn's Christian faith, and I agreed that was a big part of the picture. But there's also much philosophical meditation in the Gulag. And the Gulag Archipelago, in the end, is an epic, an anti-epic about this terrible effort to destroy the human spirit. But it's also a deep philosophical meditation on what is man. And so I would say you put all that together and you have something sui generis. Gary Saul Morrison, who's probably the best Russianist writing today, had a column in the Masterpiece series in the Wall Street Journal last week, and or a week before that, perhaps. But he called the Gulag Archipelago the greatest prose work of the 20th century. And I think I agree.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.